Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event here at Jesus College in this wonderful Frankopan Hall. It's great to have you here, whether you are here in person or watching us from online, wherever you happen to be. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Julian Huppard. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus. Now, obviously, the college has a history that goes back for a long time. We were set up in 2016 to look at some of the biggest issues of our time. And one of the things we've done right from the start was to have an annual lecture to commemorate Lisa Jardine, who was an absolutely amazing person, as you will hear, and also the first female fellow here. And it's been great to have a wide range of topics and talks through that. Now, I'm not going to be running this one. We have somebody much more important to do so and to introduce our wonderful guest speaker. And so I'm delighted to hand over to the 41st Master of Jesus College, Sunita Lane. Sunita's been here since 2019, has been a huge supporter of this lecture series and of the IF, and frankly, a brilliant master and certainly one of the two best ones I've served under here at this college. And it's wonderful to have you with us here, Sunita, for tonight. Sunita, over to you.
To be fair, I think Julian's only had two masters whilst he's been here at the college, actually. But thank you very much, Julian. What a great event. I've really been looking forward to this. You know when you have something in the diary and you go, fantastic, really looking forward to this one. Welcome to Jesus College and to this year's Lisa Jardine Memorial Lecture. Now, Lisa Jardine was a woman who broke through boundaries. She refused to be boxed in, and she had a fierce intellect. She was, as Dr. Huppert says, the first female fellow at Jesus College. She was elected in April 1976. And as a scholar, her interests spanned from English literature, cultural history, to the history of science. She published books on Robert Hooke, Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, Erasmus, the scientific revolution, and more. I think most people in this room would have been touched by her in a number of ways. Added to her scholarship was her role in UK society as a broadcaster and a commentator on the arts and the culture in the broadest sense. I recall, as a young person growing up, when she appeared on television or if she appeared on radio, I always thought that an insightful exchange would take place, and it would be something that elevated the dialogue on our national screens and also on our national airwaves. That was one thing, as someone who wanted to get into broadcasting and the media, having a woman like that where you could say, there you go, there's someone there like that, was very, very important to me growing up. So Lisa Jardine also engaged in policy making. She was a member of the Council of the Royal Institution. She held an advisory role at the Royal Society, and she spent 6 years as chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority from 2008 to 2014. Lisa's time at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority is the aspect of her life that we're drawing on today at this evening's lecture by Professor Emily Jackson. Professor Jackson was a member of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority from 2003 to 2012. She served as Lisa Jardine's deputy chair from 2008 to 2012. She's currently Professor of Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she teaches medical law. She's a Fellow of the British Academy, and she was a Judicial Appointments Commissioner from 2014 to 2017. It gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Emily Jackson, another woman with a fierce intellect, to give this year's Lisa Jardine Memorial Lecture. Professor Jackson.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction. Thank you also so much for inviting me to give the Lisa Jardine Memorial Lecture. And thank you to all of you for coming. It really is a very, very great honour to be here. I think this is a speaking invitation to which I said yes most quickly ever, because Lisa was a very important person to me. I worked, as we've just heard from the Master, very closely with Lisa for 4 years on the HFEA when I was her deputy chair between 2008 and 2012. Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority is the regulator of fertility treatment and embryo research in the UK. And Lisa was completely brilliant, academically, ferociously brilliant. She was also fearless, compassionate, but also tremendously good fun. And I think her appointment as chair of the HFEA harks back to what now actually seems like a golden age of public appointments, when being bold and being outspoken was seen as strengths rather than potential reputational risks that we need to be a bit careful about. She said what she thought, and it was brilliant. Lisa cared deeply about the work of the HFEA, particularly about the patients who are undergoing or contemplating fertility treatment. She was also absolutely fascinated by the cutting-edge science that the HFEA licensed. And I like to think that if she was still alive today, Lisa would already have done a Radio 4 point of view one Sunday morning about embryo models. She would have highlighted their transformative potential. She'd also have situated progress within a historical context, and it would all be delivered with her trademark wit and elegance. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I think, one of the 21st century's most dramatic scientific developments, which is the reprogramming of stem cells in order to create 3D models of organs and tissues. You can use human embryonic stem cells to do this sort of work, but more commonly it involves the use of what are known as induced pluripotent stem cells. Now these are often derived from skin cells and are reprogrammed into a pluripotent state, which means they have tremendous potential to become all sorts of different organs and tissues, including embryo models themselves. And twice in the last 7 years, organoids in 2017 and embryo models in 2023, this technology was chosen as Nature Method's Method of the Year. So I'm going to be talking today about embryo models and brain organoids, and in particular, their regulation. So, embryo models first. The International Society for Stem Cell Research distinguished between, in their 2021 guidelines, distinguished between two different sorts of embryo models. The science here is moving incredibly quickly, so whether or not this distinction actually continues to make sense is something that's an ongoing matter of debate. But basically, to be very, very crude, non-integrated embryo models will recapitulate a part of an embryo, not the whole thing, whereas integrated embryo models are more complete and have the capacity to undergo more integrated development if they're allowed to develop further. So it's integrated embryo models which are particularly exciting, which are very much like actual embryos. And of course, if it's possible to make from stem cells embryo models that are effectively indistinguishable from embryos, that raises really important questions for law, because how should these entities be regulated? Should the incredibly strict regime that applies to research on embryos also apply to 3D models, or are they different? Is a different approach required? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But as well as looking forwards to think about how these new entities should be regulated, I'm also going to look backwards to the 1984 Warnock report. Now this was, as some of you will be familiar with, but some of you may not, this was a committee set up in 1982 to consider how in vitro fertilisation and embryo research should be regulated in the UK. And in the early 80s, fertilisation outside of a woman's body was incredibly dramatic and new, and there was a need to think about how the law should respond. And as we face new dilemmas, as scientists can effectively make entities that are very, very like and perhaps soon actually indistinguishable from embryos, that raises new questions about how the law should respond. And I'm going to draw on a book that Sarah Franklin, who's here today, and I have just finished, which will be, shameless plug, out in May on the 14-day limit, to suggest that actually there's quite a lot from the Warnock report that continues to be helpful today. So though the issues are different, I think we can learn quite a lot from the approach that the Warnock report took to the regulation of innovative science. So why do scientists want to make embryo models? Well, importantly, it's not just to test the limits of what you can do with stem cells. There are also some really, really important things that we need to know more about. And I should, before I say something about those, warmly thank Naomi Morris from the Crick, who has given me slides from her lab to use in this talk. So these are models from the laboratory at the Crick. And I think one of the things that I was really struck with when Naomi gave me a lot of these images is just quite how beautiful some of them are, these things that are being created in labs in the UK. So why are they doing it? Well, there's a huge amount we don't know about how embryos develop. Part of this is due to this, what's often described as the black box of 14 to 28 days. It would be illegal to carry out research on embryos after 14 days in the UK, and there aren't any other sources of embryos available. So the black box of 14 to 28 days is a particular area of ignorance, but actually there's so much we don't know about embryos in general. We don't know why the most likely result from every IVF cycle is failure. We don't understand why IVF fails quite as often as it does. We don't understand why miscarriage is as common as it is. And there's a lot we don't understand about congenital abnormalities, which are a major cause of stillbirth, childhood mortality and morbidity. So there's a huge amount we could discover if we could do more research on these models. In addition, it would be possible to use embryo models in drug discovery, and that could be useful for all sorts of reasons, but that could have particular use in knowing more about why some medicines, or whether some medicines, are going to harm a developing fetus. Because I'm sure, as all of you probably know, medicines are wholly inadequately tested in pregnancy. When medicines say don't take in pregnancy on a bottle, that's not because clinical trials have taken place, it's because we just don't know. So knowing more about that would be a tremendous public health good. So if we're thinking about how these entities should be regulated, and we look to the law to try to find out whether or not they come within regulation, we can see that the law actually isn't very helpful here. The legislation that the HFEA applies, the 1990 Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, Section 1.1 just says, for this purposes of this act, embryo means a live human embryo. Now, if you think about it, that would be a really weird definition, because it would be a bit like saying, if I was going to tell you what a table is, I would say a table is a large wooden table. It doesn't tell you what it is. It assumes you know what a table is. It's in a sense specifying what sort of table I'm talking about. And that's what, in the Quintavalle judgment, Lord Millett said, that the Act assumes that readers know what an embryo is. It doesn't actually tell us. It just says, this is the type of embryo, live and human, that comes within regulation. But embryo, for the purposes of the law, has its ordinary language meaning. So where does that leave us with embryo models? Well, the HFEA, the authority Lisa was chair of, their working assumption currently is that models are not embryos, that they're something different. So currently not regulated, not covered by this piece of legislation. Now that could be superseded by a court decision which said that they should be considered embryos. It could also be changed if the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care were to implement the power under Section 1.6, which gives the power to include other things within embryo by regulations. So a very quick and easy way to regulate embryo models would be to use Section 1.6 and say embryo models count as embryos for the purposes of the Act. But that would not necessarily be a sensible thing to do. It would be a real sledgehammer because it would have an immediately chilling effect on all the research that's going on in labs in the UK. All of that would have to stop. All researchers doing this sort of work would have to apply for a license before they could do any more work. And it would be subject to an incredibly strict series of restrictions. So you could bring them within regulation by using this, but because the HFEA doesn't have a power to say, well, we're going to regulate certain sorts of embryos with a lighter touch, it would be a sledgehammer to crack that particular nut. So currently, embryo models are not regulated in the UK. So scientists are doing this research. It's going on in labs in Cambridge at the Crick, but it's not regulated. If we were to think instead about what the moral status of an embryo model is, what our obligations might be towards it, there are some people who have argued that at some point you reach some sort of tipping point where something becomes so similar to something else that it actually becomes the same thing, that it becomes the entity that it's a model of. Whether or not we're there is open to question, and whether or not that's a sensible approach, I think, is also open to question. But I think if we're thinking what the moral status of an embryo model is, it makes sense to try to work out what it is about human embryos that gives them their special status in law. Now, the embryo's special status in English law is a slightly odd special status because it is lawful, with a licence, to do research on an embryo that will lead to its destruction. So they're not protected in terms of being no prohibition on research that would be destructive. But you do have to, if you want to do that research, jump through lots and lots of hoops and be subject to loads and loads of restrictions. So it's a special status which allows destructive research, but with very, very tight parameters. So what gives rise to the embryo's moral status? Is it because it's made from human sperm and human eggs, which obviously embryo models are not? Or is it its potential to become a person or to become a baby? A potential is very complex here. Potential is even complex when you're thinking about an IVF embryo, because an IVF embryo in a dish, it doesn't actually have any potential at all on its own. It would have to be transferred to a uterus and gestated for at least 5 months before it plausibly has the potential to become a person. So there's lots of steps that you would need to take to make that potential come to fruition. The fact that this sort of research involves inducing pluripotency, making stem cells become any other type of cell, including becoming embryo models, I think is very disruptive to arguments grounded in potential. Because if my skin cell can become something that's indistinguishable from an embryo, does my skin cell have a special moral status in law? And that would be a rather peculiar place to end up. Of course, the big question in relation to embryo models and their potential is, could they implant? Could they develop further? Is this something that could become a living entity? The problem there is that we just cannot know. The research you'd need to do, the experiments you'd need to do to answer that question would be incredibly dangerous and unethical, and there aren't any respectable scientists, or any scientists to my knowledge, who have any interest in doing that. So we're at a bit of an impasse here. We just don't know what its potential is. So at this point, at this impasse point, I think it's really helpful to go back to Warnock and to think about some of the ways that Mary Warnock navigated her committee through these really difficult dilemmas. So one key step in the Warnock report's reasoning was that to accept that you're never going to get agreement on such incredibly polarizing questions as when life and personhood begins. People are just not going to agree there. These aren't simple questions of fact. So what the Warnock Committee did then is say, well, we're not going to get bogged down in what is the embryo. We're going to move on to the more important question for regulation, which is, how is it okay to treat the embryo? How is it right that embryos should be treated? So we could ask the same sort of thing here and think about, rather than what is a model, what's its moral status, how is it right to treat them? And one of the reasons why the Warnock Committee made this move, and this is something that Sarah and I explore in some detail in the book that we've just written together, is that even if there was disagreement on the committee itself about the status of embryos, there was a dissenting minority opinion in the Warnock report. There was something on which everybody could agree. The point that everybody could agree on is that some legislation is better than none, that there should be some limits that should not be crossed. So having some rules in place was a goal in and of itself, aside from obviously the important questions of what those rules might be. And reflecting on her committee's work, Mary Warnock recognised, and I think she was really, really ahead of her time here, but recognised that regulation was necessary not only to allay public concerns and reassure people, though it plays that role really importantly, it was also positively helpful for scientists. So rather than being something that scientists need to fear, it was actually really helpful for scientists to know where the boundaries are, because that enables them to get on with their work. It was also, she recognised, helpful for scientists for those decisions about what is okay and what's not okay to be taken away from them and decided by Parliament. Something that Sarah and I think also think is incredibly important about the Warnock Report is that it was so ahead of its time in recognising the importance of public engagement and that it matters how the public feels about innovative science. So the incredibly influential developmental biologist Anne McLaren, who played an absolutely pivotal role on the Warnock Committee, explaining the science to members of the committee, giving them tutorials on embryology. Her view in an interview carried out with her a few years before she died was to say, actually, the more consultation, the better. Public consultation is a good thing. And again, I think really, really ahead of her time in recognising that this is genuine two-way dialogue with the public. It's not top-down. It's not the deficit model where you assume the public knows nothing and you just need to tell them what's going on. This is actually talking to people, because people do understand things and they've got things to contribute. At the same time as public engagement being important, because I think public understanding of embryo models is quite low currently, there is a need to explain clearly and accessibly what this science is and what it hopes to achieve. And that means it's really important not to overpromise, not to suggest that if we allow embryo model research to proceed in this way, that miscarriage will be over next year, because obviously this is we need to understand a lot more before we get to any kind of treatments. So there's a danger of overpromising. There's also a danger, I think, of underpromising and reassuring people that there's no way these models could develop further, when actually that's something to which we really don't know the answer yet. So if we think about how this sort of research should be regulated, using the existing regulation of research on embryos and the International Society for Stem Cell Research guidelines as jumping off points, I want to suggest a few pointers for how you might go about regulating embryo models. First of all, you'd need to identify a regulator, and it seems obvious that the HFEA is the ideal candidate here. It's experienced, it's trusted, it's had, over the course of its lifetime, had to deal with some really difficult, complicated new issues, so it's got experience of that as well. I think there are two red lines you would want to draw in regulation immediately, two lines that should not be crossed. And one of those is transferring a model to a uterus, either human or animal. I think both of those should be prohibited in law. The current law tries to prohibit that by the section that I've put up here. No person shall place in a woman an embryo other than the permitted embryo. But some of you may have noticed that that's a very unfortunate form of words here. What that's trying to say is you shouldn't put back an embryo other than an embryo created from permitted sperm from a testes of a man and permitted eggs from the ovaries of a woman. So the law is currently trying to say only those embryos should be put back. But you can see it's a slightly unfortunate form of words, because it says you shouldn't put back an embryo other than a permitted embryo. So if these things aren't embryos, there's no prohibition in law on putting them into a woman's body, and there should be. I think there's no doubt that scientists don't want to do this, clinicians don't want to do this, but that's, I think, a red line that should be set down in law, as is transferring one of these entities into an animal's uterus. Now, the book that I've mentioned before that Sarah and I are writing is mainly focused on the 14-day limit for embryo research. And that has played an absolutely pivotal role in the regulation of embryo research here, and it's been widely copied across the world. So the 14-day rule, for those of you who aren't aware of this, is a really bright red line. You must not culture an embryo in vitro for longer than 14 days. If you do, you can go to prison for quite a long time. So it's a really strict red line that the law sets. And it's played, I think, quite an important role in reassuring people that this research is happening, but there are limits on how far this can go. The problem is that 14 days doesn't work for embryo models. There isn't a day zero, in the same way as there is with embryos created by fertilization. But also, they don't develop in a linear way from day 1, day 2, day 3, and so on. They can jump to a more advanced stage of development. So 14 days doesn't work. The International Society for Stem Cell Research 2021 guidelines suggested that you should cultivate them for the minimum time necessary to achieve the scientific objective. And that's probably a sensible limit to have in law, but I'm not sure it's enough on its own because it looks like something that you could extend again and again and again, that it doesn't have any sort of backstop. So I think it's very hard to think about how you would express this, and I don't think there's an easy solution here, but I think probably you would want some sort of combination of this provision, minimum time necessary, and some sort of backstop after which research wouldn't continue. Now, for embryo research, there's another restriction, which is you can only do it for certain very, very limited specified purposes, such as improving fertility treatments. That's too narrow here, and I think there's no need here for purposes. In relation to embryos, there's also what's often described as the necessity principle. So the regulation of embryo research requires researchers to prove to the HFEA that they couldn't do their research without using embryos. If you could do the research without using embryos, you can't get a license. So that means if you could use stem cells, if you could use animal models, you can't get a license for doing embryo research. Whether or not that's sensible is another matter, but that's in the law at the moment. What that means, therefore, is that the Act currently contains an inbuilt presumption that if you can use a model instead of an embryo, you should. And so there's already, the law does already have that effect, that if you could use embryo models for research, you must. What might make more sense in relation to embryo models might be some sort of preference for using the least complex model necessary to do the research. Whether that's necessary will be something we'll have to debate when the time comes to regulate. You'd also need consent. The donors of the skin cells need to have given consent, and that consent needs to be very broad so that it encompasses what scientists are doing here, or the restrictions that are placed on the consent need to be respected. And there'll be a need to decide on what penalties you would want to put in place for non-compliance. Is the model that we have with embryo research where you can go to jail for keeping an embryo in culture for more than 14 days? Is that appropriate here? Possibly in relation to putting these things back into a woman, but I think in other cases, maybe not. So that brings me on to the relationship between this sort of research and research on embryos. I think it's widely accepted that these models are not going to entirely replace research on embryos, in part because you need to do research on embryos in order to validate the models. You need to be able to compare the two. And in fact, to that end, it might be helpful to extend the 14-day limit. There's a lot of debate out there about whether that would be a good idea, so that you could validate models that develop to a later stage. But there is an interesting debate about whether or not you could apply what you might describe as a 3Rs approach to human embryos. 3Rs, some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not, is a principle from research on animals. This idea that you should be replacing animals where you can, reducing their numbers where you can, and refining experiments where you can. Would it be sensible to have a 3 R's approach for human embryos to reduce the use of them by using models instead? Well, possibly, but actually I think there's a very compelling counter-argument to that, which is that a lot of patients whose children wouldn't have existed without embryo research actually express quite a strong preference to donate their leftover embryos to research rather than discarding them and disposing of them. At the Progress Educational Trust annual conference last year, Kathy Nycombe from Cambridge gave this incredibly moving talk about the lengths to which patients go to donate their leftover embryos to research. You're driving around trying to find labs that will take their embryos. So actually you could argue that respecting patients' wishes is also really important here, giving people the option of donating leftover embryos for research. The one key difference between embryo models and embryos is scale. So as one scientist working in this area, Robin Lovell-Badge, said to me fairly recently, you could make hundreds of thousands of embryo models relatively easily, whereas embryos are a very scarce and precious resource. So one of the things that would enable is high throughput toxicology testing for drug discovery. It would be illegal to do research for drug discovery on embryos, and it would be impossible because there simply aren't enough of them. But that would change with embryo models. In addition, you could use embryo models to replace the use of sentient animal models. In many ways, this would be a better solution, better in two ways, because the results would be more accurate because they'd be human rather than animals, but also less suffering. So in many ways, that might be a benefit to this sort of research. I'm going to move on now to talk about brain organoids, which raise some similar but also some different issues. So brain organoids are self-organising 3D brain surrogates, again created from induced pluripotent stem cells. And what they do is they enable scientists for the very first time to carry out research on living human brain tissue. Currently, if you want to do research on brain disorders, you're limited to either dead tissue donated post-mortem, scans of living people's brains, or animal models, all of which, for obvious reasons, are of limited usefulness. So actually being able to do experiments on living human brain tissue in the laboratory is potentially incredibly exciting. Huge potential to understand more about brain disorders, and we all know why that would be a very good thing. But concerns have been raised about the capacities of these organoids, with headlines like this one, brain cells being taught to play the simple video game Pong. There's also been coverage of studies which have suggested that electrical activity in a brain organoid is rather similar to that of a premature baby. And that makes people quite anxious about what's going on with this brain in a dish. It's important to bear in mind, though, that these brain organoids are tiny, so we are not talking about brain in a vat. This isn't a whole human brain in a lab. These are very small, but they are comparable to the brains of some animals. They're tiny, absolutely minute compared to human brains, but they are comparable to brains of some animals. They can also be connected to other cells, to other organoids, and even to robotic bodies. So the really interesting question, and the difficult question that arises here, is could a brain organoid ever develop rudimentary consciousness or sentience? There are huge disagreements among philosophers, amongst neuroscientists, about what these concepts even mean. I've only recently started to dip my toe into the literature on what consciousness is and what sentience is, and it's huge, and people really disagree with each other. So some people argue passionately that plants are sentient, and other people argue equally passionately that they couldn't be. So there's this vast literature about what we even mean by these concepts. In addition, it's really difficult to judge consciousness and sentience in an entity that can't communicate, but also can't exhibit behaviours. So if you're doing research on an animal, you can find out about its sentience because you can do experiments where it might self-administer painkillers in response to a stress event. That's not going to happen here. So how do we even tell? So at the moment, most people think that the brain organoids that have been developed so far are not capable of consciousness and sentient. Most people think that. There's a few people who think that we have got there, but they're very, very, very much in the minority. But the important question, I think, here is not whether brain organoids are currently sentient, but whether they might become sentient, and whether we can now say that it's impossible that that would happen. And I think we can't say that. We don't know for sure. So there's a huge amount we don't know about the capacity of brain organoids. So in the face of that sort of uncertainty, some people argue that it's sensible to take a precautionary approach. This is familiar from environmental science, and the idea that if you've got a possible outcome that's very, very bad indeed, you shouldn't wait for 100% proof of certainty before you start to take action against it. So a precautionary approach here might seem sensible, that if we're worried that we've got entities that might develop some kind of rudimentary sentience, we should err on the side of caution and treat them as if they are or might be. But there are dangers. That might seem like a really innocuous, sensible way to approach this, but I think there are dangers to adopting a precautionary approach here. Because if you were to stop research, which might, for example, lead to a cure for dementia, out of what turns out to be misplaced concern for the interests of this very rudimentary clump of cells, there are real people who would suffer as a result. So being overly precautionary comes with its own risks. But the new issue, and it is genuinely a new issue for law, there really isn't anything that we can, where this is the case so far, is the idea of obligations that might be owed to potentially sentient brain tissue in vitro. We don't have any other type of human tissue in vitro that might have sentience. So to paraphrase Thomas Nagel with a really wonderful essay of his some years ago, the important question here is there something, or could there be something that it's like to be an organoid, in the same way as he asked what it was like to be a bat? And the brutally honest answer is we actually don't know whether there could ever be something that it's like to be an organoid. But we do know this is a new issue. And I think as well as the idea that the brain tissue might be potentially sentient, there's another consideration at play here, I think. And that's because of the symbolic importance of our brains. Because when we think of who we are, we think of ourselves as our brains. It's who we are in a very much more fundamental sense than other bits of our bodies. And that's what Philip Ball, science writer, editor of Nature, wrote when he had one of his skin cells turned into a brain organoid. One of the things that's particularly unsettling here is the brain tissue that you make in this way is a clone of the person whose skin cell was used to create the iPS cell. So what you're looking at when you're looking at your own brain organoid in dish is a clone of you. It's exactly the same brain tissue as yours. And so he writes really, I think, interestingly about this curious intimacy involved, this potential that wasn't there in the little bit of skin that had been excised from him. So one of the reasons why brain organoids are so small is the lack of a blood supply, which you could solve by implanting organoids into animal hosts. So one way to make them bigger would be to implant them, give them a blood supply, implant them into an animal host. So this raises the question of what we do about the possibility of implanting human brain organoids into animals. It would still be very, very small. We're not talking about mice with whole human brains. So just to be clear, this is a tiny, very tiny bit of brain. It's not the whole thing. But nevertheless, it would be a chimera. It would be an animal with human tissue inside it. At the moment, this has been done, and at the moment there's no evidence that having human brain organoids implanted in animals enhances them. At the moment, we really don't have any evidence of enhancement. But if that were to happen, there are going to be some difficult questions to address. I think there would certainly perhaps have to be more restrictions on what you could do with chimeras than with humanized brains, than what you can do with other sorts of animals. And I think particularly difficult issues would arise if you transferred a human brain organoid to a non-human primate, to an animal that's actually very close to us. That I think the idea of creating a creature which is quite like us with a humanized brain, I think is difficult to contemplate, and we would have to think very carefully about what sort of restrictions you would place on what could be done to those sorts of animals. At the same time, so there's one of the interesting things, as I say, just dipping my toe in this kind of literature, is there is this vast amount of ink spilt on whether organoids might have any capacity for consciousness and sentience, and what on earth we should do if they do. And it's quite striking when you think about it that we regularly carry out research on animals that we know to be sentient. So all of this concern about these human organoids, you think, well, maybe there should be a bit more concern about the animals who are used in research, where we know that they're capable of pain and fear, etc. And I think that raises the interesting question about whether or not is what we're most concerned about the human element of the organoid, or are we most concerned about interests? If it's the capacity for suffering that we're interested in, we should maybe think about how we treat animals. If it's its humanness, then that is obviously something different. Maybe it's both. But I think you could argue that using brain organoids is better than using animal models for the same reasons I mentioned previously. You would get better results because they're human. You would also get less harm. So unlike embryo models, there's the potential for brain organoids to be used clinically. So this is a real difference here. And this has happened already. So brain organoids were used a few years ago when it became evident that pregnant women who were infected with the Zika virus were having babies with a very serious brain disorder. So brain organoids were used in order to work out how the Zika virus was responsible for these brain disorders in babies, in order to find a cure for that and to find a treatment which enabled women who had been infected with the Zika virus to have children who didn't suffer from serious brain disorders. You could also use brain organoids as part of personalised medicine, and that would involve creating a patient-specific organoid, your own organoid, and testing medication on it to see if it would be likely to work for you, likely to be expensive and therefore unlikely to be routinely available. In the future, so this is a long way off, you could potentially use brain organoids in transplantation. So perhaps if somebody has suffered traumatic brain injury. Clearly, you would need a load of research to be done before you could get anywhere near thinking that that was safe. So that's really a very, very long way off. The risk there is obviously you implant a bit of brain tissue into somebody, and if it changes their personality in an alarming way, it might be quite difficult to remove it. So the risks are huge. There are currently hundreds of patents being registered each year for organoid technology. So this is developing very fast, and there are intellectual property rights all over the place for this sort of technique. And obviously, intellectual property rights are a double-edged sword. They can drive innovation, but they can also mean that treatments are expensive and widen health inequalities. So as I've hinted already, the regulation of brain organoids is currently a bit problematic because we just treat them like any other type of tissue. This may be fine at the moment. The question is whether it's fine in the future if things change. So the regulation of human tissue research focuses on protecting the donor's interests. So, for example, you have to have the tissue donor's consent. If you're doing human tissue research, you also need policies in place for what are described as incidental findings. So if you're doing research on human tissue, you might incidentally find out something relevant to the donor's health. And you need a policy in place to say, do you feed that back or do you not? So this is all about protecting the tissue donor. Similarly, issues around data protection and also things like making sure disposal is appropriate, premises are suitable, and that there's traceability so that you can find out what happens to human tissue samples as they move around. So as I said before, there really is no precedent for research on tissue that might have interests of its own. That's a new thing for us. There are two models that I think are potentially helpful or relevant here. We've got what I've mentioned already, the regulation of embryo research, and that's a system of regulation, the purpose of which is to regulate symbolically important human entities. Embryo research rules, which stop embryos being used for frivolous reasons, don't protect the individual embryo, because a frivolously used embryo doesn't suffer any more or less harm than a non-frivolously used embryo. So it's very much about symbolic importance of these entities. And then we have animal research rules, and that system of regulation is dealing with entities that can experience suffering. So maybe we could think about bringing those two together to see where we might end up. And so I think in terms of what a new regulatory approach might look like, I think similarly to embryo models, I think there's a huge need for public engagement to find out how the public feels about this sort of research, what worries them. There's been some very limited public dialogue work to date on brain organoids. It suggests people are worried about commercialisation, they're worried about health inequalities, and they're also particularly worried about perfectionism and the possibility that this sort of research might be used to reduce diversity. As with embryo research and tissue research, you'd need the donor's consent. That would be really, really important. But I think this sort of, particularly brain organoid research, I think is something that should be being kept under review. There should be somebody that's keeping an eye on this, because if the science changes and there is evidence of sentience, then something needs to happen, something needs to be done. Now, I think the model that's probably most useful to do that is the animal research model, because the three main goals of the rules that cover research on animals, minimization and prevention of suffering, the need to justify the use of protected animals, and certain red lines, certain prohibitions. You can't do research on great apes, you can't use animals for cosmetic testing. So there's prohibitions, minimization of suffering, and the need to justify use of animals in the first place. Added to that, in relation to organoids, I think the body that's currently responsible for animal research might be interested in organoids as a possible replacement for animals as part of the 3Rs approach, which is what's supposed to drive animal research. You could replace animals with organoids. But also, if chimeras are being created, they obviously fall already within the animal research regulatory regime. So it seems to make sense that the body that's currently regulating animal research to have brain organoid research under its wing, as with a sort of watching brief for what's happening here. I think the key thing that we may need to define here is when protective measures become necessary and at what point the research has to stop, what point it's not okay to do this. I think that's what we need to think about for the future. I wanted to close by going back to people. So Duncan Wilson has talked about the actor-centred study of bioethics, in which you identify key actors who have played a pivotal role in demonstrating that regulation can be an enabler of science rather than just an impediment to it. It can be good for science to be regulated. And I think Mary Warnock herself obviously was a key individual there. But one of the things that's really, really striking about the field of embryology is how many of the people who've played these important roles have been women from the 1980s onwards. So obviously Mary Warnock herself, Anne McLaren, who was hugely influential, and then a series of chairs of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, including Lisa, Ruth Deach, Susie Leather, Sally Cheshire, and now Julia Chain. So to close, I couldn't put it better than Frank Dobson did in his very memorable speaker's lecture in 2017, which when he was summing up Lisa, she brought to her role on the HFEA her knowledge of science, her deep concern for patients, her flair for explaining complex ideas, and her political nous. And that meant she was purpose-built for the job. So I think it's hard to imagine that Jesus College could have chosen a better trailblazer for the role of women in public life than when it appointed Lisa as its first female fellow nearly 48 years ago. And I'll close there.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant as a tribute, as rich content and really, really stimulating ideas. So thank you so much. We do now have a lot of time for questions from the audience. If you're online, please do use the Q&A feature and I'll raise them here. And if you're in the room, please do raise a hand. We'll start just up there.
So I'm interested in this discussion about embryology and embryo models. And one of the things that you didn't mention, and I wonder about the moral and legal implications of, is this idea that there's an evolutionary sort of culling at the embryo stage of genetic differences, and somehow that's a very important stage in evolution and making sure that the genes stay strong. So how do we think about that when we're starting to get into embryo models, and has there been a lot of work on that?
I mean, I think obviously this research isn't being done in order to create entities for reproduction. I think that's really important. So what scientists are doing here is trying to find out more about how those sorts of mechanisms work in the embryo. What is it that's switched on and what's switched off? So I think there's just so much we don't know about all of those sorts of things that I think this model research wants to do. So I think it's really important to remember that these are not people trying to make potential babies. These are scientists trying to understand why we don't know enough about how potential babies are made, why we have huge gaps in our knowledge there. So yes, I think there are all sorts of interesting things you could find out with models. There are also things that you can't find out with models. So things like the impact of the uterine environment on the developing fetus and signals between the mother's body and the babies. Obviously, models aren't going to have that, so there's also a lot that you wouldn't find out. But I just think embryo models aren't going to solve all of the issues we don't know, but they're certainly going to expand some of the things that gaps that we have at the moment.
There's a question over here.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. In relation to the previous question, what you've just said about the influence of the mother's body and so on, obviously one of the things you've told us is that a real block to the further development of the embryoids is that they're not implanted. But there has been development in vitro work developing placental sufficiency. So if you get to a point where you have in parallel the embryoids and in vitro placentas, are you then getting into dangerous territory that you could well extend the viability of the embryoids so that they could develop sentience and maybe more?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I didn't talk about another really, really fascinating use of organoid technology is to make placental organoids. And that's obviously, there's so much we don't know about that as well. So yes, absolutely. But I think that's one of the things that we need to grapple with now. And this is one of the reasons why I think public engagement here is really important, that it is possible that these things could develop in culture for a really quite sizable period of time. And I think we need to think how people think about that and at what point people think that should stop. And there's lots and lots of discussions going on in Cambridge, loads of discussions going on about what the stopping point might be. What is it that we don't want these things to develop? But you're absolutely right that there is the potential for these entities to be cultured in vitro for quite a sizable period of time and to develop in all sorts of ways, particularly when using things like placental organoids. So I think, when the 1990 Act was passed, it was a kind of set of rules that were a compromise to enable this sort of research to proceed, but within a set of restrictions that meant people were reassured that there were limits. And the big question we're facing now is, what is the limit that could help this sort of research by reassuring people that this won't go this further. And to be honest, we just don't know what the right answer to that is at the moment. But as I said, lots of conversations are happening here about this and throughout the world, and those are really important conversations. And I think one of the things that I feel really passionately about is I think it's really important that the public is involved in these discussions, because I think Warnock was right, that it matters how the public feels about these things.
Can I bring in a question from online from anonymous attendee, one of our regular people? British legislation aside, when it comes to embryo research, what are other countries doing or deciding about these issues? Is there a global consensus?
It's a really good question, because what it points up a really interesting problem in the law. So science moves very quickly and the law moves very, very slowly. So you're almost always in this kind of catch-up situation where science is going on and doing all sorts of things and the law is proceeding at a snail's pace. And what that means is that how different countries worldwide are approaching embryo models is entirely dependent on the form of words that we used in legislation drafted long before embryo models became possible. So in the UK, I mentioned our definition, which is a non-definition, but in other countries, they have other sorts of definitions which are absolutely haphazardly, so not intentionally at all, because this stuff is quite new and the embryo research regulation tends to be older. Completely haphazardly, it may either facilitate this sort of research or hamper it. So in Australia, the definition of embryo looks as though it includes these sorts of entities because it's worded differently, which means that Australian scientists doing this research are doing so in a much, much more restrictive environment than here. And then you have other countries that prohibit certain things, like might prohibit all research on embryos, but by default allow this because they don't mention it. So what you always have with the law is you have law drafted before something became possible that has to try to keep up. And sometimes, felicitously, it works well, and other times it doesn't. And I think one example of that with our own law is the fact that the prohibition on placing anything other than a permitted embryo in a woman's body is unhelpfully drafted from the point of view of models, because nobody thought that this sort of thing would be possible when that was drafted.
I think you've addressed another question here from Sarah Norcross. If I take the question at the back there, then there's one at the front.
Ian Stewart, retired obstetrician. There seems to be a gulf between the law relating to abortion and embryo research. Society allows women to choose to abort a healthy fetus up to the age of 24 weeks gestation, and yet a woman cannot donate her embryos for use in research beyond 14 days. Have you any comments relating to that?
I mean, they're obviously very different scenarios, aren't they? I mean, you've got an embryo in vitro is a very different thing from an embryo that's developing inside a woman's body, and she obviously has rights to make decisions about her body in a way that there's just no parallel if you're talking about an embryo in a dish. So I would say they're rather different things, and I think it would be peculiar to suggest that you should allow an embryo to be cultured in vitro up until the time at which you'd allow abortion, because that would be really quite late if you were to enable women to terminate their pregnancies later in pregnancy. So they are different. I think they're just different. I think the fact that you've got when you've got an embryo in vitro, you've just got the embryo. If it's inside a woman's body, it's her life and her body that she is making decisions about.
Question at the front.
Hello. I have a couple questions, if it's okay. First of all, one of is about the red lines that you mentioned about the embryo models. So obviously the transfer of a model into a human uterus is very unethical and a risky move, but what do you think about the animal models and transferring an animal-based embryo model into an animal, like artificial animal uterus? My first question is that. And second question is about the 14-day rule. And I guess from one perspective, like this will be a little bit controversial, but it can be considered an arbitrary rule with the recent technological advancements about our idea of how primitive streak formation and neural differentiation, so for example, is there any way of considering the recent advancements on our idea around neural differentiation and the first time that the embryo starts that and extending that rule?
Yes. So, sorry, what was your first question?
About the animal.
Yes. So that research is going on. So there are mice embryo models. There have been experiments in which they've been transferred to mice. So yes, that research is happening. Sorry?
Between a mouse and a primate model, for example, where is the line in there, in your
So
opinion?
you would obviously need you'd need to have a license in order to do this sort of research on animals from the Home Office in order to do it, and you would have to establish that you were complying with all of the restrictions in the Animals Scientific Procedures Act. And there are much more restrictions on doing research on primates than there are on mice currently. So I'm not sure that it would be completely impossible to get a license to do this research on primates, but I'm not aware of any research that's going on. But it may be. But in terms of, sorry, your second question. Sorry, I've 14-day rule. Yes, sorry. So I think, yes, there are lots of people who think that 14-day rule should be extended, and there are all sorts of reasons why people might argue that, for the reasons you give, but others as well. And I think that's something that I think Parliament will have to consider. At the moment, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority has made some recommendations to the Department of Health and Social Care about what should happen to reform of the Act. There is I think, widespread agreement that the Act needs to be reformed for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily just to do with science. And one of the big questions that will have to be faced when the Act is, if the Act is opened up after the next election, is whether or not there's any appetite to extend the 14-day rule. And there, as I say, lots of people think that it should happen, and that there'll be lots and lots of good reasons for doing that. So yeah, I think you're right. There are good reasons for thinking that the 14-day rule might come up for revision. I think in relation to the fact that it's arbitrary, I think you're right, it is arbitrary, but any time limit is arbitrary. So, for example, the voting age is arbitrary. You can vote when you're 18, but that's not because on your 18th birthday you suddenly get endowed with marvellous political nous, which you didn't have the day before. Similarly with driving, you don't miraculously become able to drive on your 17th birthday. So I think we have limits in law which are inevitably arbitrary. It's not necessarily a bad thing to say there needs to be a limit, and this is a reasonable place to put it. And that's very much what the Warnock Committee were doing. They were, although obviously they tethered it to the primitive street, I think they weren't saying this is some obvious line, it has to be here. They were saying there is an explanation for it being here, but it's a regulatory limit. It has to be drawn somewhere, and here is a reasonable place to draw it.
So a question over here, and then I've got a couple from online. And then
Thank you very much for that brilliant lecture. My question is about science rather than law, and it relates to something which I think you said very early on, a passing reference to this, that the sort of research that you've been describing in such detail could have implications for addressing chromosomal abnormalities. Now, if I've correctly recalled what you said, I'd be very interested if you could just expand on that a little more as to how that might come about and when and by whom.
Well, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not the right person to answer that. I think what the best way I can answer that question is to say that there's so much we don't understand about why an embryo fails to develop or develops in a certain way. And so this, using models, enables you to understand more about why it might develop a congenital abnormality, a chromosomal abnormality. And we just don't understand enough about that. So I think it's important to stress that this is very much basic research. It's a lack of knowledge that this research is plugging. So it's understanding how embryos develop, because you can do more research and different research than you can do on the very scarce and precious resource of embryos. So it's just understanding more about how embryos develop in different ways.
can I bring in a couple of questions from online? One from Sarah Norcross. Have you considered heart organoids? People attribute many different things to the heart, such as their identity and feelings of romance, fear, etc. Would you apply the same thought process you outlined for brain organoids to their development?
I think that's super interesting. I think I I haven't really done any work so far on heart organoids, but that will be really interesting to consider. I mean, I think slightly different in the sense that although our heart is incredibly important and has all these symbolic resonances, I think the key thing with brain organoids is the idea of sentience, and I don't think we think of our heart as sentient tissue in the same way as our brains. So it comes back to that Thomas Nagel thing. Is there something that it's like to be an organoid? I don't think there's something that it's like to be a piece of heart tissue.
I should probably welcome the Master to...
Yeah, you mentioned in your talk the loads of patents that are being kind of put forward in this area. And commercialisation kind of can sometimes push people and go, you talked about science and then the laws catching up. Commercialisation is another kind of thing that pushes us to where we might not want to get to. Are there any kind of patterns that you've seen that you sort of think, well, that's actually really worrying?
No, I'm not an intellectual property lawyer, so I'm not well equipped to say whether there are any patents that are worrying. But I do think there is a really interesting question because in relation to there are certain things you can't patent because they seem to be contrary to ordre public, and embryos, for example, are something that you can't have patents in. And so there are some quite interesting discussions going on about whether or not this sort of particularly organoid technology could develop to a point at which it wouldn't be appropriate for there to be a patent in it. At the moment, there are patents, and there are lots of them. But whether or not, if these things were to develop to a point at which there was the thought that it might have some kind of rudimentary consciousness, is that something that you shouldn't be able to have a patent in? And those are big, interesting questions that I think are out there.
At the front there.
Thank you very much. Fascinating topic and lots of food for thought. Looking a little bit into the future, and I'm scared myself because I don't know how far I have to look, but at some point we will have purely synthetic DNA. We have synthetic DNA where we cannot say it's human DNA or it's animal DNA or whatnot. It has been derived from a form of ChatGPT that was trained on all of the DNA available. And probably we're just months or years away from this. What do we do in this case? What do we do in this case when we say this is now not necessarily even live in a traditional form? It's a fully synthetic thing, but it has the same replicating functions like an embryo. What do we do with this? Do we have to regulate this? Do we want to regulate this?
I mean, I think probably regulation is often a good idea if there's something that's terrifying to people. Regulation could be quite a good sort of handrail to make people think somebody has got this. I think you're absolutely right that there are multiple other issues that I haven't mentioned today for lots of reasons because I didn't really have the time to. But obviously AI is another area where people are worried about consciousness and sentience and the idea that AI could develop in a way that it could develop some sort of interests of its own. And I think there's an interesting crossover there because you could have an AI that's hooked up to an organoid and then you could have something that's both AI and organoid technology together. So I think you're right, there are some scary things on the horizon, which is why I think, in a sense, law needs to be in on the discussions about what sort of regulation do we need. But also I think what I was just hoping to indicate towards the end in relation to brain organoids, even if we don't need to regulate this now, do we need to be thinking about which body should be, in a sense, keeping an eye on this to make sure that we're not running away with something that turns out to be terrifying?
There's a question up there.
Just about public engagement. I suspect if you were to mention to sort of someone in the street now that experiments were happening on brain organoids, quite a few would have a sort of yuck response. That's wrong, and that would probably go for quite a lot of some of the other issues you've talked about. Whereas if they were to understand the issues better, that might change. So how much is public engagement about respecting the limits of the public where it is now as against trying to educate and change views?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I think so. There's quite a good model which has been going on recently in relation to embryo research, and is currently doing some work on embryo models, which is sometimes described as public dialogue. So it's not just an opinion poll where you might get the "oh, this is all so scary" response, but more giving people access to resources, getting people to talk about it and think about the issues with some kind of materials to help them see what's going on. And I think there was the work that's been done to date on embryos was really interesting because it touched a bit on embryo models, and there's more going to be coming out specifically on embryo models soon. But the thing that I thought was so interesting when I first saw the results of this was that in this dialogue where people had been exposed to a whole range of materials, what was so fascinating is that people were not talking about this in terms of Frankenstein science and scariness. The main theme seemed to be excitement. This is extraordinary. Why didn't we know more about it? We want to know more about it. And as I alluded to, there has been some public engagement work on brain organoids, and that's found the same thing, that when people understand a bit about what it is scientists are doing, there's an excitement and a desire to know more. So I think you're absolutely right. Public engagement can't just be about like a vox pop where you say, what do you think of a brain that can play Pong? Because you're not going to get people thinking about it. But I think if you do get people thinking about it, there is a tremendous amount of excitement about science. Because I think we all know people who suffer from brain disorders. We all know the pain and suffering that it causes. So I think the idea that there might be scientific routes to find out more about that, I think people do feel very excited by.
We're beginning to run out of time. I know there's a lot more questions. I'll try and fit as many as I can in. So,
thank you. I mean, that was great indeed. My question was, you've partly answered it when the question came in about the feelings around the world. I mean, at a time when we just had the announcement in Alabama about life starting at 0 on that sort of arbitrary limit thing, are you, on one hand, optimistic, or are you sort of nervous about how much has got to be worked out quite quickly? And do you feel that, rather like in the way that IVF has worked and the regulation of IVF has worked in this country, do you feel Britain is particularly going to have to get going with it because it's somehow our culture of the science and ethics means that everybody's looking to sort of try and work out what are we doing? I mean, do you feel a pressure to be trying to answer these questions?
I think you raised a really, really important issue, actually, on. I think the Alabama case is a really important case in point. That I think the UK's had this really perfectly sensible regulation of embryo research and fertility treatment in place for 33 years now, since the HFEA came into force. And I think one can take that for granted and think that if you open up this act to think about how you might include models or 14 days, should you extend it, I think you can be complacent. Someone like me could be complacent and think, well, there's perfectly sensible arguments for doing this, so that would happen. But I think we can look to the United States as an indication that it doesn't always go that way. There isn't some inexorable progress at work, and that if you open up the laws in this area for revision, you could get something that was much more restrictive and profoundly unhelpful. So I think we need to be very careful about not taking for granted the rather liberal set of laws we have in this country, because the Alabama rule will rule out fertility treatment for so many people. So the impact isn't just on abortion. Obviously, it has that impact, but it will mean that IVF becomes impossible. And IVF is a way in which so many wanted children have come into the world that the idea that you would just rule out enabling anybody to do this just seems extraordinary. But I think we can't take for granted progress, and we need to be alive to the fact that there are people who would prefer this not to happen at all.
There are lots more questions around and online. I mean, the online ones are largely about, Alabama and the fact that IVF has been shut down now. And also about public engagement, particularly praising another great woman, Jennifer Doudna, and her work on CRISPR. Getting on the same. But I think we'll have one last question from the room, and I saw one. Well, you can ask about Alabama then. No. Then we have time for one final question. Yes.
That was a fantastic lecture, and I can't help wondering this. Is there a concern that rogue scientists, either here or overseas, driven by curiosity, will simply ride roughshod over all the red lines? Maybe you'll say that has happened, or I don't know. But if it does happen, does the result of their work then
progressively add to the corpus of scientific knowledge?
That's a really, really interesting and huge question. But I think you're absolutely right. So I think if you talk to the public about what worries them, rogue scientists is very high on the list, and the idea that we might be able to control what happens in the UK, but there's no guarantees that bad things won't happen in other countries. And of course that's happened with CRISPR that you just mentioned, the premature use of CRISPR in babies in China, and the person who did that went to prison for doing that. So yes, rogue scientists going too far too quickly, I think is an ever-present danger. I think obviously the UK can't regulate for the whole world, but it can make sure that the regulation in the UK is keeping people reassured that couldn't happen here. But you're totally right. And I think the danger of the dangers here are not just people doing research in less well-regulated environments in ways that we think would be undesirable. But there's also, I think, a real risk to patients, because there's a real risk of offering treatments to people prematurely when it's not safe enough yet. And we've seen that a lot with stem cell transplants, that there are some rogue operators in unregulated jurisdictions which offer completely false hope to people with spinal injuries. They're injecting people with industrial grade substances which they really shouldn't be, and there's no hope of curing their spinal injury. But because people heard about stem cell science and think this must be helpful, there are people who will travel overseas for really, really very dodgy things. So as well as the kind of rogue scientists, there's also a need to protect patients from prematurely going overseas to receive treatment with new organoid technology.
Emily, thank you so much for an absolutely brilliant lecture and taking so many questions. It's been really fantastic.